1981. What a year. It was a time of two massive seismic shifts. On one side, you had the launch of the IBM PC, and on the other, you had the absolute golden age of arcade games. We're talking about the birth of franchises that are still around, the creation of entire genres, rules that still influence gaming today. This was the moment we finally shifted away from simple, fixed-screen shooters and started getting games with complex mechanics, real characters, and even actual stories.
You can't talk about 1981 without starting in the arcade. And you definitely can't talk about it without mentioning Donkey Kong. This game practically established the platformer. It was created by a young Shigeru Miyamoto, who was given the job of salvaging thousands of unsold RadarScope arcade cabinets for Nintendo. Get this, the game was originally supposed to be a Popeye game. When that deal fell through, Miyamoto had to invent a whole new cast of characters: the damsel in distress, Pauline, the ape, Donkey Kong, and the hero, this little carpenter, originally named Jumpman. This was one of the first games ever to have a visual, on-screen story. You see the kidnapping. And the multi-stage obstacle course design, where you actually had to jump, was a radical departure from the Space Invaders and Pac-Man era. Jumpman, of course, was later renamed to Mario, and he became a bit of a global mascot. Next up, Konami's Scramble. This game invented the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up genre. Before Scramble, pretty much all shooters were fixed screen or maybe scrolled vertically. Scramble introduced forced horizontal scrolling, taking you through distinct, seamless sections like caves, cities, and a final missile base. It gave you dual weapons, an air-to-air laser, and air-to-ground bombs. But the real kicker? A limited, depletable fuel supply. This forced you to play aggressively, destroying fuel tanks just to stay in the air, adding an early layer of resource management to all that action. Then you had Defender. This thing was a phenomenon. Designed by Eugene Jarvis for Williams Electronics, it sold over 55,000 units and became one of the highest-grossing arcade games ever. But it was notorious for its complex 5-button control scheme: thrust, reverse, fire, smart bomb, and hyperspace. It was incredibly difficult to master, but it gave you this amazing level of immersion. It was the first game to feature a minimap or radar at the top of the screen, so you could track the whole game world. And it pioneered gameplay where you actually had to protect defenseless little humanoids on the ground from being abducted. Of course, Namco fired back with Galaga. This sequel to Galaxian kept the fixed-screen shooting, but added way more complex enemy patterns. Its defining feature, though, was the capture mechanic. A boss Galaga could hit you with a tractor beam and capture your ship. Now, if you used your next life to shoot that boss Galaga while it was attacking, you'd rescue your original ship, and it would join yours, forming a dual fighter with double the firepower. It was this brilliant, high-risk, high-reward strategy. And how can we forget Frogger, a true pop culture icon? The goal is simple, right? Just guide 5 frogs across a super busy highway and a treacherous river. But it was addictive. Frogger appealed to a much broader audience, including many women, which was unusual at the time. It wasn't about aggression, it was just pure timing, pattern recognition, and careful maneuvering. Finally, Atari's Tempest. This game was a technical showcase. It was a tube shooter that used cutting-edge vector graphics. This meant it drew images with bright geometric lines instead of chunky pixels, and it looked like nothing else in the arcade. It was one of the first games to use Atari's color quadriscan display, and it was also the first arcade game to let you select your starting difficulty level. But the action wasn't just in the arcade. The first major computer games were starting to appear, especially on the Apple II. The first was Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This was essentially the first party-based computer RPG. It was a direct translation of the Dungeons & Dragons experience. You created a party of up to 6 characters, fighters, priests, mages, thieves, and dove into this first-person wireframe dungeon. That level of complex party management was a massive leap for the genre. It became enormously successful and was a key inspiration for future JRPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And right alongside it was Ultima 1, the First Age of Darkness. This was the official start of one of the longest-running RPG series ever. Created by a teenager named Richard Garriott, aka Lord British, it blended top-down world exploration with first-person 3D dungeon crawling. And then, it famously mixed its medieval fantasy setting with science fiction. You'd suddenly be in space combat. It was this epic, genre-bending game that blew people's minds. So what were we playing all these games on? 1981 was a pivotal year for home hardware, pushing the boundaries of low-cost computing. But the really big one, the one that truly blew the doors open for home computing, was the Commodore VIC-20. When it was released in January 1981 for just $299, that's about $1,060 today. It wasn't just another computer, it was a revolution in a beige box. This machine was a game changer, designed from the ground up with one goal: be cheap. While other computers were still hovering around the $1,000 mark, the VIC-20 brought color graphics and, crucially, a proper typewriter-style keyboard to the masses, at a price that could compete head-to-head with video game consoles like the Atari 2600. And unlike the Atari 400, with its strange membrane keyboard, the VIC-20 felt like a real instrument. This was huge. Suddenly, you didn't have to go to a specialty electronics store to buy a computer. This was one of the first computers you could just pick up at Kmart or a department store, right alongside the toasters and televisions. Commodore's marketing was brilliant, plastering the friendly computer all over their ads and even hiring William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself, to tell families they needed one. It completely demystified the computer, turning it from an intimidating piece of office equipment into a household appliance. And it worked beyond their wildest dreams. The VIC-20 became the first computer from any company ever to sell over 1 million units. The backstory here is pure Jack Tramiel. Commodore's aggressive president was famous for his motto, "Computers for the masses, not the classes." He saw this enormous new market for low-priced computers just waiting to be cracked. As it happened, Commodore's chip division, MAS Technology, had designed this video interface chip, the VIC, or MAS 6560, that they originally hoped to sell to arcade manufacturers or other console makers. But nobody was buying it. They were stuck with a chip they couldn't sell. So, in a classic Tramiel move, he basically said, "Fine, if we can't sell the chip, we'll build a whole computer around it." They built it fast, and they built it to a price. Sure, it was limited, famously shipping with only 5K of RAM, just 3.5K of which was actually available to the user, but that didn't stop it. It plugged into your TV, it played games, it could teach you BASIC, and it was affordable. The VIC-20 wasn't just a product, it was the spark that lit the home computer boom of the 1980s.
Meanwhile, over in Japan, a different kind of battle for the living room was heating up, and it gave us the Epoch Cassette Vision. Now, this console might not be a household name in the West, but it's a fascinating and crucial piece of video game history. Before Nintendo's Famicom showed up and rewrote all the rules, the Cassette Vision was the best-selling system in Japan. It was the undisputed king of the hill for a brief, important moment. And it got there with a really unique, incredibly clever design, built entirely around keeping costs as low as humanly possible. When you bought a Cassette Vision, the console itself was, well, it was practically an empty shell. It was just a box with the power supply, the controllers, which were famously built right into the unit, and the video output to plug into your TV. There was no central brain, no main processor inside the console at all. So where was the actual computer? It was inside the game cartridge.
That's right. The actual CPU and the ROM for the game were both housed in that big, chunky cart. Every time you slotted in a new game, you were essentially plugging in an entirely new, dedicated computer built just for that one title. This was a wild engineering trade-off. It meant the cartridges themselves were significantly more expensive, since they contained all the expensive chips. But the console was dirt cheap to manufacture, making it an incredibly easy purchase for families to get in the door. This design had another, even more forward-thinking benefit. They could theoretically advance the console's technology just by improving the carts. The system wasn't locked into 1981-era hardware forever. If a more powerful, cheaper CPU became available a year later, Epoch could just start building that into their new game cartridges. It was a brilliant, if slightly strange way to future-proof a system, and it's exactly what allowed them to conquer the Japanese market, at least for a little while. Then there was the VTech Creativision, and this machine, well, it had a bit of an identity crisis. It wasn't just a console, but it wasn't quite a full-fledged computer either. It landed in this strange middle ground, totally blurring the lines between a game system and a low-end home computer like the VIC-20. The most obvious sign of this was its incredibly strange design. It came with two complex joysticks that weren't just sticks, they also had a full membrane keypad on them, like a high-tech calculator. But here was the real party trick. The top of the console had two big slots, and you could take both of those controllers and physically slot them right into the machine side by side. When they clicked into place, they formed a single, very clunky, very makeshift computer keyboard. It was a wild piece of transforming hardware. And this bizarre design revealed VTech's entire strategy. VTech, that's video technology, was already a big name in electronic learning aids, and their goal was to capture both the red-hot gaming market and the new educational market with one single machine. They were trying to sell parents on a serious device that could teach typing and programming, while at the same time trying to sell kids on an awesome video game system. It was this all-in-one hybrid, a Trojan horse, to get computing into the home under the guise of education. Or maybe it was an educational tool disguised as a game console. With the Creativision, it was honestly hard to tell. And finally, over in the UK, you simply can't talk about 1981 tech without mentioning the Sinclair ZX81. Released in March, this little black wedge of a machine wasn't just another computer, it was a complete and total breakthrough in price. While Commodore was winning praise for hitting $299, Sir Clive Sinclair's new machine just shattered the floor entirely. You could get it as a mail-order kit, one you had to solder together yourself for just under 50 pounds. If you wanted it pre-built, it was only about 70. This was a price point that made personal computing genuinely affordable for an even wider audience, especially kids, students, and hobbyists with more enthusiasm than cash. This wasn't a family purchase you had to save up for. This was almost pocket money territory. It was all part of Clive Sinclair's fanatical vision to democratize computing. He was a man obsessed with making electronics smaller and cheaper, and the ZX81 was his masterpiece of obsessive cost-cutting and super compact design. And when we say cost-cutting, we mean it. To get the price that low, compromises were made everywhere. It didn't have a proper keyboard, just a flat, touch-sensitive membrane panel that was notoriously difficult to type on. It famously shipped with only 1 kilobyte of RAM. 1 K. It had no dedicated sound or color graphics, just black and white text and blocky characters. The whole machine ran on just 4 main chips. It was the absolute bare-bones definition of a computer. But that was the point. It was cheap, it worked, and it got millions of people, especially in Britain, to write their very first lines of code.
So we've got the games, we've got the hardware. But the biggest story of 1981, the one that truly changed everything, wasn't a game at all. It was the introduction of the IBM personal computer 5150. We cannot overstate how big this was. This was the moment the home computer stopped being a hobbyist's toy and got legitimized as a serious business tool. IBM's brand made the PC a staple for offices. When the IBM Personal Computer Model 5150 dropped on August 12, 1981, it wasn't just another machine, it was the moment computing got serious. Up until then, if you were a big corporation, you saw things like the Apple II or the Commodore PET as, honestly, toys. But when IBM, the company that built the colossal mainframes that ran the world's businesses, when they decided to enter the market, the whole landscape shifted. It was like they gave the entire corporate world permission to buy a desktop computer. Now, the price wasn't exactly a bargain. That base model started at $1,565, which is over $5,000 today, with almost nothing in it. But people paid it because they trusted the badge. They trusted the sheer quality of the build, especially that now legendary 83-key keyboard that was famously solid and gave you a tactile click with every stroke. It felt like a serious professional instrument. But the real genius of the 5150 came from a desperate decision. Under a brutal one-year deadline, IBM couldn't build everything themselves. They broke all their corporate rules and decided to embrace what they called open architecture. They used cheap, readily available, off-the-shelf components, such as the processor, the Intel 8088, humming along at just 4.77 megahertz. It was an odd choice. Internally, it could crunch data in 16-bit chunks, but it was hobbled by an 8-bit data bus. That means the chip had to pull information from the rest of the computer over a smaller pipe. IBM did this on purpose, though. It was a cost-saving measure that let them use cheaper hardware components elsewhere in the machine. Then there was the memory. The cheapest entry-level model was almost a joke, a measly 16 kilobytes of RAM. You heard that right, kilobytes. Serious users would push that up to 64 kilobytes on the board. And for storage, if you skipped the expensive floppy drives, you found a remnant of the hobbyist era, a cassette port on the back. Yes, you had to save your multi-thousand-dollar program to an audio tape, just like the little Commodore machines. When it came to visuals, the business user faced a classic choice, a true dilemma. The MDA card gave you super crisp, high-resolution text on a monochrome green or amber screen. It was perfect for that critical spreadsheet or word processing document. Or, the CGA card gave you color, and color was essential for games like Flight Simulator, but at a heavy price. It was blocky, low resolution, topping out at a maximum of 320 by 200 resolution in just 4 colors. You had to choose professional clarity or digital fun. Finally, the operating system, the very soul of the machine. IBM was in a rush, remember, and they decided to use an outside vendor for the OS. Their first choice fell through. So they called a young entrepreneur, you might have heard, named Bill Gates at Microsoft. Gates actually didn't have an operating system yet, but he was sharp, he was determined, and he had a solution up his sleeve. Gates quickly bought the rights to a rudimentary system called Q-DOS. That's the Quick and Dirty Operating System, written by Tim Patterson. Microsoft polished it up, fixed the bugs, and delivered it to IBM as PC-DOS 1.0. Now here is the million-dollar mistake IBM made. They only licensed the system for their own use, allowing Microsoft to retain the right to sell the same core software to anyone else. When the clone makers came along, they all lined up to buy the same system, but from Microsoft, calling it MS-DOS. That single licensing clause turned Microsoft into the giant we know today. But what was PC-DOS or MS-DOS? Based from the name, Microsoft's disk operating system, you get the idea. First and foremost, it was a disk and file manager.
The most crucial capability was dealing with those big 5.25-inch floppy disks. You could copy files, delete files, or check the contents with the dir command. But here's how primitive it was. In the initial version, you couldn't create folders. Every single file on that disk had to live in one root directory, making organization a nightmare. Beyond that, the OS acted as the essential interpreter between the software and the hardware, the BIOS. This let application developers write programs like the era-defining spreadsheet VisiCalc and know that the system would reliably handle talking to the keyboard, the screen, and the printer. And it had one clever automation trick, the AutoExec bat file. You could write a series of commands in this file, and the computer would execute them automatically every time you powered up. It was the system's simple way of running commands and loading drivers before you started work. Ultimately, PC-DOS 1.0 was not a marvel of design. It was a simple, sturdy disk management layer. It was exactly what was needed to run the business applications that justified the IBM PC's massive price tag, and it paved the way for the entire future of the personal computing industry. Another thing that paved the road for the broad onboarding of the personal computer industry was the fact that IBM even published the machine's schematics. This openness was revolutionary, but it was also the decision that would eventually undo their dominance. Why? Because it allowed the birth of the IBM PC clones. Companies like Compaq could simply copy the architecture, sell the exact same capability for much less, and turn the IBM design into a massive, standardized platform, the bedrock of modern computing.
Meanwhile, in the golden era of arcades, Atari was the undisputed king. 1981 was a banner year, driven by hits like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. The U.S. arcade market alone generated an estimated $4.8 billion. But the cracks were already showing. In 1981, Atari rushed to release a home port of Pac-Man for the 2600. It sold millions, but the game was awful. It looked and played nothing like the arcade original, and it severely damaged consumer confidence. This wasn't the only problem. 4 of Atari's best game designers, guys who felt totally unappreciated and received no credit or royalties for their hits, had already resigned back in 1979 to form their own company, Activision. By 1981, Activision's success was undeniable. Their legal battle with Atari officially established the third-party developer as a legitimate business model. This opened the floodgates for everyone to start making games, which would eventually lead to a market saturation of low-quality titles. And we all know how that ended.